Welcome to today's film analysis, why I didn't watch the remake of The Little Mermaid. I booked my ticket a week in advance. Please allow me this personal introduction. I wanted to watch this film on release day, but the closer the date came, the more reluctant I was. And on the day, it was terrible. I watched the trailers again, listened to the new and old songs, read a few reviews, and the reluctance was suddenly so great that I decided at the last moment not to watch this film and to cancel the ticket so that Disney wouldn't receive my 12 euros. Why did I decide not to watch this film? Usually I like to face the bad, but the point is not that The Little Mermaid is quite likely a bad film. Those can be insightful, sometimes even entertaining, reveal ideology. Failure may also illuminate. The Little Mermaid, however, is a different phenomenon. This new Disney culture is a new phenomenon. Yes, we had a silly discussion beforehand about whether POC actress Halle Bailey should be allowed to play a character originally white in the cartoon. It's a very silly discussion. There will always be cranks upset about such things, of course, but if even this transformation is no longer granted to cinema, that mythical creatures can be embodied by all kinds of people, we have really reached the end of cinema, the end of thinking. Perhaps there is already a Disney strategy behind the casting. At least that's why someone is talking about the film at all. Otherwise, no one discusses Disney films anymore. Basically, what we find in all these casting discussions is what was summed up by that wonderful meme on drone warfare many years ago. It shows two civilians, a man, a woman being bombed by drones. The man says that next time the drones are supposed to be controlled by women. The woman next to him replies, "Really makes you feel like you're part of history." It's a similar story with Disney. The Disney live action suffers from its aesthetic poverty, as the trailer proves. It already suggests the film neither to inspire nor to surprise. It represents a remake and a live-action adaptation, almost unbearable what Disney has done with the wonderful cartoon characters. Let's just take Sebastian the Crab. In the live-action film, he looks like a crab. But that is not the reason why you watch the film. The stupidity is unbearable to believe that you must recreate nature and then just let these figures, these little animals speak and everything is fine. You have created something new. No, the opposite is the case. Even the scenes under the sea. The trailer already showed that everything is pitch black again. It looks like this sea is a 5-week-old bouillabaisse. Furthermore, the music was partly renewed. New music was contributed by Lin-Manuel Miranda. That too leads us to expect bad things. Remake means to create something new that exists independently. It must be more than a technical update, leading one to say live-action film comes as close to reality as is currently possible. The remake stands always under a certain compulsion to justify itself because the original exists. The question for a remake is therefore always, why do you need to be made when the original already exists? Connection between the remake and the original is undeniable. The remake relates to the original in a certain way. How remake and original interact can be interesting for the audience, with all the independence that the remake must have. Those would be approaches to a remake, but The Little Mermaid, even with Disney thinking, ceased to exist. Remake at Disney simply means to copy. While fashion brands fight counterfeits, Disney simply counterfeits itself. The problem, these films no longer have any relevance. It's only interesting to lawyers now, which design was used, which logo, which names, which rights were perhaps violated. Only copyright law is of interest. We are dealing with a culture of the dead hand. In liberal countries, wills have been restricted in such a way that those who bequeath can no longer dispose so brutally of what may or may not happen with their money. Very clear rules have been set, limits are set, because one does not want the dead hand to rule the future. The heirs are free to decide on many things themselves. The person who wrote the will no longer has the right to dispose of it, but we ourselves live in a culture of the dead hand, which is determined by the dead, by old copyrights. And this zombie culture of the dead hand produces a piece of art like The Little Mermaid. A production in keeping with the zeitgeist, where we also encounter the undead all the time. In this respect, The Little Mermaid functions as a seismograph of our time. Blockbuster cinema still reflects our society, but not in terms of content. It is no longer worth watching these films. In terms of content, there is no longer anything that can be drawn from them. For example, conclusions about society, but the phenomenon itself suffices as an observation. You don't need to know anything more. Film is a special commodity, as it is quite risky investment. You don't know whether the audience enters the cinema, but if you make such a risky investment, you can earn a particularly high return if the film is successful. Now, of course, you try to minimize the risk and keep the return high by creating this culture of the undead, by cannibalizing established brands. You know there is a big audience for Little Mermaid films. Even if these fans don't like the trailer, they comply and watch the film. With this culture of imitation, a culture solely designed to make a profit, blockbuster cinema is losing its relevance. As cultural theorist Fredric Jameson has said for the past few decades, we live in a culture of nostalgia. But one also wonders, what will the nostalgia of the future look like if it tries to relate to our time? Will one be nostalgic, subjected to the remake of the remake of the remake? In any case, we are treading water. The debate about representation shows this all too clearly, unable to create anything new. But we are all allowed to ride on the merry-go-round now, which after all only turns in circles. We also must clear up a misunderstanding about live-action film adaptations. There are already over a dozen of them. Disney came up with this idea that you must create something now that wasn't possible before. But animated films are not created out of a lack of real actors, just as you wouldn't define a painter as someone lacking a camera. The material of The Little Mermaid is not the originality, not what is told that has been told before, but how. But accusing the culture industry of homogenization and standardization of its serial character is nothing new. That has always tended to be true, but now there is something else. The diagnosis that there is nothing new anymore is not exactly a new diagnosis either. This is also the problem of Giulietta Caldas, who wrote in an essay entitled Everything in Retrograde. The irony of writing this essay is that the phenomena I try to describe have themselves been articulated endlessly, modified and recycled. As I have gotten further into writing it, I have asked myself more frequently and more seriously what the point of it is. I don't have anything to say that Frederick Jameson and Mark Fisher have not already said. What made me first consider writing it was a feeling of madness at some new reunion, revival or reboot, and of a certain black thread at the idea that the makers of capital C culture will keep on making it out of whatever they have to hand as the earth burns and sinks below water. End of quote. I deeply relate to her frustration, reminiscent of Mark Fisher's thesis that the future has disappeared. Fisher also said neoliberal capitalism has gradually but systematically deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. Is it only the systemic lack of alternatives evident in product like The Little Mermaid? If we think about Mao's Cultural Revolution, we stumble upon the interesting phenomenon that not only was all Western culture banned, but they also severely curtailed their own culture. During the Cultural Revolution, only 5 model operas, 2 ballets and 1 symphony were allowed to be performed. Of course, censorship is no longer necessary today. It is enough capital to delegate attention in such a way that the other hardly takes place. In fact, we are treading water with blockbuster production, Disney being the best example. But there is also a lot of other stuff that doesn't happen anymore because we don't see it. And the decisive difference between Mao's communism and our capitalism lies in the promise of the market, as it will at least offer us a great diversity. And diversity is the high-value word of our time. But it applies less and less to blockbuster cinema. One thing is the remake and sequel and live-action film culture, but the other is the irrelevance of what can be called content. And it is also the lack of beauty. The Little Mermaid from 1989 was a beautiful film. It set technical standards, of course, but the creativity that unfolded there was enormous, even though it was a product of the culture industry to increase returns. The remakes trailer gathers tastelessness. When we talk about AI, we often talk about probability. This is how ChatGPT works. The software chooses by probability one word to follow the other. We also talk about alignment. So how do you have to align the AIs to execute an action or let go of it? That's basically Disney's strategy as well. How do we increase the probability of people buying cinema tickets? Let's just take Little Mermaid again. And then how do we align it a little to the zeitgeist so that people don't say it's problematic? Returning to the beginning, why didn't I see The Little Mermaid recently? Well, it was the fear of boredom. Boredom does not refer to leisure time, the time when you really get to thinking. Boredom rather means that we are dealing with a product in this film that helps us kill time without us really noticing it. We experience a boredom that is also a time of distraction. After all, there is a lot going on in this film, $200 million US budget, there must be something going on. In the past, the culture industry was designed to offer compensation for monotonous, gainful employment. The modern working world has changed a lot, including a foosball table in the lounge. The working world is supposed to offer spectacle, while in leisure time one is transformed back into the factory worker who is supposed to consume films like The Little Mermaid as if on an assembly line. The cultural critic Mark Fisher suffered from late capitalism's bleakness and its artistic monotony. He asks, has boredom disappeared, in an essay entitled "No One is Bored, Everything is Boring." Fisher writes, but if the contemporary form of capitalism has extirpated boredom, it has not vanquished the boring. On the contrary, you could argue that the boring is ubiquitous. For the most part, we have given up any expectation of being surprised by culture, and that goes for experimental culture as much as popular culture. Whether it is music that sounds like it could have come out 20, 30, 40 years ago, Hollywood blockbusters that recycle and reboot concepts, characters and tropes that were exhausted long ago, or the tired gestures of so much contemporary art, the boring is everywhere. It is just that no one is bored because there is no longer any subject capable of being bored. End of quote. For real, boredom only arises when one is addressed as a subject. But that's no longer the point. A film like The Little Mermaid only uses us as passive spectators, delegated to the cinema hall by skillful marketing. There we expose ourselves to this distraction. Mark Fisher writes about the disappearance of boredom with simultaneous presence of boredom. Perhaps the feeling, he writes, most characteristic of our current moment is a mixture of boredom and compulsion. And for me, it was not only the compulsion of the film critic to watch the new Little Mermaid film as a matter of course for the film analysis, but also a general compulsion. You must see the new Disney film. And this compulsion is crucially coupled with boredom. Fisher goes on to write, even though we recognize that they are boring, we nevertheless feel compelled to do yet another Facebook quiz, to read yet another BuzzFeed list, to click on some celebrity gossip about someone we don't even remotely care about. End of quote. Or, one might add, watch the new Little Mermaid movie. Fisher continues, we endlessly move among the boring, but our nervous systems are so overstimulated that we never have the luxury of feeling bored. No one is bored, everything is boring. End of quote. Let's allow ourselves the luxury of boredom again by refusing. Because out of the attitude of refusal first comes an emptiness that is to be filled. For example, by reading texts by Mark Fisher. Films like The Little Mermaid remake lead not only blockbuster cinema, but also film criticism to a dead end. And that's ultimately where talking and thinking about films ends. The film reviews of The Little Mermaid basically read like the film reviews of the live-action versions of Aladdin, Pinocchio, The Jungle Book, and so on. But this is not due to the unimaginativeness of the film critics. There is simply nothing more of relevance to say about these films. And that is the difference to the usual culture industry we know, in which there are, of course, trends towards homogenization, towards the serial, but the former culture industry used to mirror society. That in turn has now disappeared with this new stage of Disneyfication. All we can really do is remain silent. But by not watching The Little Mermaid, we can come out of boredom into a thinking that might lead us to no longer watch, but see. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.